Hey, don't generate useless shit. Let's talk about it. I'm a tools guy. I build tools. If you see me building a game, it's usually because I built a tool that could do well in a game. And so you will see me do exactly that. Create a tool, create the game for it. So if I figure out a tool to create a million unique faces, guess what? You're about to get a game that features a million unique faces. If I can put down a million pieces of debris, you're about to get a game about a million pieces of debris. If I can create planets, you're about to get a game about planets. Cityscapes, you're about to get a game about cities. Spaceships, you're about to get a game about spaceships. When I say you're about to get, I actually mean I'm about to build it and throw it away because 99% of them turn out to be complete crap. As an expert on crap, let me go ahead and tell you a problem with procedural content. The biggest pitfall of procedural content. As more and more procedural content comes down the lanes, I find that it's clear that people aren't really giving this as much thought as they should because they're generating useless shit. There's nothing wrong with procedural content, but there is something wrong with useless shit. Let me give you an example. Your game is about a space buggy, and your players are driving the space buggy around, and you need to cover this world in trees. How do you do it? Well, you could simulate it. Every tree has its own genome, and you factor in parameters like the amount of sun this particular longitude and latitude gets, and the precipitation, and whether or not there are insects that can, pollinate flowering plants. And then, of course, you can simulate the trees, and every tree will be utterly unique, and the players can marvel at the branches as they drive by at 400 kilometers an hour. You don't do that, because that's dumb. What you do is you get the standard brush that comes with every content system, every engine, every terrain system, and you just splat down like 4 different trees. The player is not going to notice that you're repeating the same 4 trees over and over and over because the player is driving at 400 kilometers an hour in a space buggy. They need the trees to set the tone, but they do not need them all to be unique or carefully crafted or interesting. They are just background noise. And that is the big difference in terms of how you should be thinking about your content. Are you generating what the player needs and no more? Because if you're generating more than the player needs, that's a waste of everybody's time. So, let's give you another example. You have figured out how to generate millions and millions of unique characters. So you decide that you're going to set your next game in London, and you're going to basically generate all of London, and all of the characters that the game will create are all going to be unique and interesting, and the player is going to fall in love with all of them. It's going to be such a beautiful experience, but that's not enough. You're going to create a database with all of these characters in them, and as you pass by this character, guess what? They're actually sisters with the character that you passed by 10 minutes ago, and this character owns the coffee shop that you ate at, but they're at war with that character who owns a different coffee shop, and then of course this person and that person are married, but then they got divorced, and then that sounds amazing. You're filling out this deep and intricate world that the player will never care about in the slightest. It's a huge waste of time. Why would the player ever care about any of these details? These details are completely worthless, and these details are almost worthless. What can you do to these NPCs? How can you interact with them? Well, you can kill them. They don't need faces for that. You can steal cash from them. They don't need faces for that. Brilliant idea. You can recruit them. You can recruit anybody. Anybody can be a freedom fighter. Well, what does that mean practically? If 10,000 people walk by the player is not going to say, oh, all 10,000 of these people are unique and interesting individuals that I must investigate. No, they're just going to be scanning for interesting features. And by interesting features, we're talking about 2 things. Features that are very rare, and features that are stupid and don't match the designated parameters of the gameplay. So in this case, we're recruiting freedom fighters, people who are going to kick all of the ass. So obviously that means we're going to recruit the little old ladies because that's funny. our little old ladies with AK-47s are funny, and so those are the characters we're going to recruit. But those characters are not being procedurally generated, by which I mean the meshes and the variations and the hair and all that stuff gets put in by the actual team, the scripters and the modelers. The procedural part does not generate any old ladiness. There's nothing emergent about being an old lady. You put the old lady content into the system. So the procedural generation isn't creating anything the player cares about. The procedural content system is just spitting out things that you put into it, and the players are caring about the things that you put into it, not about whatever the procedural elements are. And that's the biggest problem with this kind of setup, because if the player is going to care about something, in order for the player to care about something, you need to make them care. There has to be a reason for them to care. And if you just give them 10,000 characters that are all varied, they're going to find reasons to care that are just dumb. And it's just going to be stupid, because that's the point. The player is looking at 10,000 things, and what's going to stick out? Oh, wouldn't it be funny if we hired the guy in the giant rubber mascot suit? Because that would be hilarious to watch him try and, wield an AK-47. So now you're going to recruit all of the guys in the giant mascot suits. But you know what? Those giant mascot suits were put there by the modelers. They weren't generated on the fly by a procedural system. And if they were, then you wouldn't want them, because there would now be a million mascot characters, and you'd look for the people who weren't mascot characters, because those would be the more interesting ones. If the only thing the procedural content system spat out were old ladies and mascot characters, you would be looking for the least old and the least lady and the least mascot that you could find, just because that would be what would stand out. This is why you have to be very careful with how you use procedural content. Normally speaking, there are only a few reasons that you actually want to use procedural content generation. One is if you need to create variations on something, then you put in procedural content to just create variations, and you make it as cheap and fast as possible. If you have 10,000 thugs and you just want the player to not notice the fact that it's the same thug over and over and over, you put in procedural face generation, which just amounts to a slightly, 1 of 10 textures and then some face morphs. You don't spend all year creating a custom system that relates these thugs and their family members together. The other reason that you might use a procedural content system is to create a field, to create a tactical situation. This is what you normally see in successful procedural content games. For example, in FTL, what does FTL generate? It procedurally generates a level layout. And the level layout is super simple. This is not something that gets simulated in deep detail. It's just a node graph that you proceed along. But it gives you the tactical options. There's never going to be, the map isn't going to be, oh, where do you want to go? You've got a billion different options. It's like, where do you want to go? You've got 3 options. And then after that, you're going to have, those options are going to lead to these potential options. So you're going to want to, plan ahead a little bit, but you do not have a lot of choices here. That's how you do it. You're using a tactical content. Here's an example of, if we are going to generate all of Lendon, how do we make all of those complicated things with the different faces and the deep engine with all the connections, how do we make that actually interesting? Well, we make it tactical. You do not meet everybody in Lendon. You meet 3 people. Maybe it's because you are badly scarred, or maybe it's because the cops are looking for you, so you can't afford to go out into the wild, or maybe it's because you just have extreme social anxiety, and these 3 people happen to be the only 3 people in your building, and you refuse to go outside, whatever, right? But the point is, when you choose which of these 3 people to, interact with, to become friends with, or whatever, they have those relationships, and that leads to other options. So, you've just talked to Doug, and Doug has a sister, and Doug also has a mom, and Doug also has his favorite pet groomer. These are situations where you can see how you can start to feel out the stuff that we're creating. But here's the key. You're not creating 10 million characters and throwing them at the player. All you're doing is creating 3, and then another 3, and then another 3. This kind of limitation allows you to make these characters matter to the player, and you make the tactical choices matter. That's not a hard way to do it, but it is a way that you can't get if you are doing an open world hacking game. So fundamentally, you have to be careful about the kinds of games you're creating and the kinds of content generation you're using, because sometimes they just aren't compatible. You've got to think, how can I make this content matter to the player? And if you can't, then you don't want it. Just do it cheap. If the player is never going to care whose sister this is or whether or not this person has a slightly hooked nose, then don't put that shit in. Just create the templates and then create morphs that can turn the templates into a couple dozen variants. That's all you need to do. And then you can even go further and you can actually create scripted characters that have actual scripted lines. Can you imagine? Obviously, I could go on all week. Hey, look, I can generate planets. What should I do? I know, I should generate 1,000,000 billion planets, and then I should tell the player that they should visit every single one of these planets to gather resources and spend 15 minutes at each. And I definitely know that they will care about each of these planets deeply because I've told them that they will have to leave in 15 minutes. Again, generating all of these planets is useless because you're specifically creating a game where the player will not care. You've told them not to care about these planets. It doesn't matter how awesomely you've generated them. They don't matter. The only thing the character has is a checklist of resources that they need. They just pick the planet with those resources, go get them, and then leave again. That's the nature of this vanilla pudding, or whatever they call it, oatmeal. When you get procedural content that all blends together, it's because the player isn't engaging with the content in the right way. And so you're generating things the player doesn't care about, i.e. useless shit. I think that's probably enough of this concept. I just wanted to make it clear that you should really consider how the player is actually going to engage with your procedural system. If the player isn't, then don't use it. Just do something simpler.